Good evening and welcome to the Silicon Valley Entrepreneur, a series of conversations with startup founders and their investors on what it takes to build a viable, fundable company. I'm Chris Gill, President and CEO of SVAys, the largest and fastest growing not-for-profit organization for entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. This evening I'm delighted to have with us Jed White from TribeVibe, who was the winner of a recent First Impressions pitch feedback contest that we had with SVAys a couple of weeks ago. And delighted to have you here, Jed. So thank you very much for coming along.
Oh, Chris, thank you very much for having me here.
Not at all. So it's apparent from your accent that you're not from here. Tell us a little bit about what brought you here in the first place.
Okay, so I'm from Australia originally and grew up in Queensland, Australia, and was based in Sydney. And I'm a software developer, and my passion in life is the nexus of media and technology. And we, myself and two co-founders, Joe and Darren, have been working on the idea behind TribeVibe for a while, basically the algorithm probably the last year and a half. And we realised that for the sort of product we were trying to develop, that the US is the home of the universe for this stuff. So for web applications, for social media, for media technology, we had to figure out how to get over here. So we did some planning, figured out how to best try and get over to the United States, and have come over to set up shop and to develop the product and bring it to market.
That's a pretty bold move, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But how did you come up with the idea for TribeVibe?
Okay, so my background was in working in traditional media and software development. So I was the editor-in-chief and publishing director of the biggest group of computer magazines in the Asia Pacific. For PBL, which is the biggest media company back there. And we had to deal pretty early on with the fact that people were going to go to the web and that content was going to move away from, I think anyway, being the province of traditional corporate controlled media to a world of more consumer and citizen generated media, and a world in which there's much more of a long tail in media production and consumption. And the long-term trends, I think, are already clearly heading in that direction. There's far more activity in the TechCrunch style side of professional media than in the traditional big New York Times, Hearst Corporation. Traditional media is under a lot of pressure at the moment. And what I think is really interesting is when you look in specialist areas and niche media, and particularly blogging, you're starting to see a real change, because it turns out for things like product reviews and recommendations, the sort of things computer magazines used to do in the past and dominate. These days, people tend to trust recommendations from those they consider to be their peers and their friends far more than they do traditional media. And you're seeing that with communities like mummy bloggers or tech bloggers, where people who are considered to be part of the community hold a great deal of weight. And the fact that the Federal Trade Commission has started looking at regulating and trying to get bloggers to disclose their commercial arrangements, and it's an indication of how much commercial effort is going into that area. And you look at what Walmart's doing with its family panel, and Nestle with its recent Nestle family scandal on Twitter, and there's a lot of corporate activity now shifting from putting investment into traditional TV and newspaper and magazine style advertising, and not just following the large commercial sites on the web, but going into these sort of more niche media forms. And I think that's a trend that's probably going to continue, that already, I think since 2006, more than 50% of the content consumed on the web is consumer generated in one form or another. But when you actually look at it, it's not an even distribution. It's not as though all consumers are creating that media. There's 10% of internet users who are producing most of the content that's consumed by the other 90%. But it's certainly a lot more diverse than it used to be. And I'm a great believer in Larry Lessig, the copyright lawyer's theory, that in the 20th century you saw very much a read-only culture develop. And this was an aberration. When you look in the past, most cultures have been shared cultures where people tell stories or sing songs around the fireplace, or and the 20th century, where it became much more about one-way broadcast of information, broadcast TV and newspaper distribution really took off and became the dominant form of media consumption and sharing. And that was historically probably a bit of an aberration. And I think what we're seeing now is things shifting back the other way again, where even though there are certain key influences in society, media is far more democratized, and social media is, I think, going to become more and more prevalent. And the commercial support structures for it and the way that advertisers and corporate messaging work is shifting in that direction. So we've been looking at these trends, I guess, for a while, and having come out of that background. And having blogged quite a bit myself and been a journalist in a past life as well as a coder, it struck me, well, it's actually pretty difficult to keep on top of what's happening to the stuff you make. So if you're a writer, every writer wants to be read. Everyone who produces video content or podcasts or slide presentations or animations wants their stuff to be seen, shared, linked and talked about. People have a natural imperative for their stuff to be influential. And as it stands today, it's actually really tough to keep on top of what happens when you put a piece of content out there. You get, if you like, weak signals. So you get to see your analytics, so you get to see the raw, number of impressions and raw number of visitors. And you can go and do a Twitter search and try and figure out, okay, well, who's looking at who's talking about me or the same topics that I'm writing about. And you can track all your friends' Facebook profiles, and you can go and search on Dig or stumble upon. But it's actually a very diverse picture, and it's very hard to get a good idea of, okay, well, out of the different pieces of content I'm putting out there, what has high resonance? What's actually creating engagement and excitement and controversy, and trying to keep track of that. And part of that is the fact that in this new world, it's not about mass reach. So I love the example of TechCrunch because Michael Arrington doesn't have the raw audience of the New York Times or CNET. But within his target audience, TechCrunch is incredibly influential and has almost 100% penetration amongst the people who they're trying to reach.
Yep.
And they generate a lot of noise and a lot of controversy. And when they write about stuff, other people pick it up, blog about it, talk about it on Twitter. There are long conversation threads that take place. People share it on Dig and Facebook and across all these other different social media sites. But if you're Michael Arrington, you've got a real problem that really your ability to compete against, say, VentureBeat or the New York Times Bits column or against other potential advertising media when you're going and talking to potential advertisers comes back to not what your raw traffic is, because what matters more is your resonance with a particular target audience or with a more niche group of people. And the amount of activity and interest and engagement across social media is a very powerful indicator of that resonance and that level of influence that a publication like TechCrunch has. And when you think about all the people who are using the web for expertise marketing, so for example, a friend of mine, Joachim, who I was talking about a little bit earlier with you from WSGR, he runs the startup company Lawyer Blog. Now, when you think about why he blogs about startup company legal issues, he's got a fairly specialised audience. He's not trying to reach tens of thousands of people, but he carries a lot of weight and influence within that specialised domain space.
Yes.
And he puts effort into that, I would say, because that's a very powerful form of expertise marketing. It's a way of him demonstrating his credentials, and then hopefully people will come to WSGR when they're starting startups to be their law firm. And when you look at a lot of the blogging that's taking place and a lot of the use of social media, people are using it for social and reputation management and for expertise marketing. But it's very hard to know what the return on the investment that goes into all those hours spent blogging and talking with people on Facebook and sharing your stuff is. Similarly, if you're a corporation and you've invested in community management and social media stuff and setting up a Twitter account and setting up a corporate blog, it's very hard to track what the real return on that investment is as it stands today. So anyway, we looked at all this space and thought, well, what you really need is a single place where you can bring all that information together, and a method of comparing and ranking the amount of resonance that people have, the amount of influence they have across social media. And that's where we came up with the idea for TriedVibe. Originally it was quite a broad idea and we've sort of narrowed it down a bit, but essentially that was the essence of it.
Okay, so let's go back a bit to how you ended up over here. So what was the decision making to move from Australia? Because you can build a Web 2.0 type property anywhere.
Absolutely.
So why come here?
Okay, a couple of reasons behind it. One, there is a concentration of intellect, energy, capital, people, and ideas, particularly around Silicon Valley. In media, there's a similar concentration of energy around New York. And for a web-based startup, it's not just about writing the code and putting it out on the web. You need to be, I think, part of an ecosystem, and you need the ether of entrepreneurialism, which helps support a startup and get it going. And Australia is a really interesting place. It's got a well-educated population. Its technology uptake is similar to the US. People are keen on new technologies. Broadband penetration is pretty good. It's a really interesting country that way. But my feeling, this is just my 2 cents, is that it's culturally more like Britain in that it's more risk averse, and failure is seen as having a high social stigma attached to it. And there is less of a culture, I think, of innovation. When you look at the, for example, the research and development grant system that exists in Australia, it's almost all used by big companies, and it's dominated by mining and agriculture and the resources sector. And lots of people are trying to get a groundswell movement of entrepreneurial activity and startups going in Australia. But it's a tough environment to do it in. There's not a lot of ecosystem or support infrastructure there. Secondly, when you look at the patterns behind successful web-based startups, their ability to engage with other web-based startups is key. So for example, if you are doing a tool like ours, to get picked up and have our badge, for example, included on other sites, or to be included on the sites run by popular bloggers, to be linked through to and to be talked about is a key driver for things taking off virally. And it's not that you can't do that from anywhere in the world, but if you can build relationships with people and people actually know you and you can talk to them and they've seen your stuff, then I think you're far more likely to get support and that process will happen faster. The third thing is the more formal corporate partnerships, so the ability to benefit from advice and the experience of other people who've done it before. So having had experience working with big media was useful to us because all three members of our team had worked for large media companies in the past. But the problem is that this new world is not going to be dominated by big media. It's going to be dominated by networks of smaller, more niche media companies, I think, and individual practitioners, people doing it for passion and love as well as for commercial purposes. And the people who have influence in those areas tend to be parts of communities. They tend to help each other out. So I mentioned mummy blogging before. Mummy blogging is really interesting because Jo, who's looking after our marketing and evangelism, is herself a mummy blogger. And it's a really interesting community. It's a community that helps each other out. When someone launches a new initiative within, they will tend to go out very actively and tweet about what other people in the community are doing. They'll support each other. It's, you know, there are different camps there, obviously, but people by and large are pretty supportive of each other. And I think to tap into those networks and those communities, sometimes physical presence does make a big difference.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing too is that I mentioned before the accelerator that we were part of, but having the ability to get support from mentors and from people who've done it before is something that's difficult to find in Australia. In Australia, on the ground, there aren't many web-scale startups that have taken off and done really well. So there are some Australian companies, you know, guys like Mike Cannon-Brooks, who have come over here and have done very well. And there are properties like, for example, the mapping stuff that came out of Australia that was acquired by Google.
Yes.
But those guys all come over here, and they tend to be based over here. So finding and tapping into the experience of people who have built highly scalable, capital-efficient startups, it's difficult to find in Australia. Australia is more dominated by services businesses, and they tend to be more traditional businesses. So the combination of those things, I think there's probably three factors there. One is a culture of innovation and support for startups. I think that's something which is, it's not unique in the world here, but it certainly has, it's got a rocket-propelled ecosystem behind it in Silicon Valley and in the United States. And even towns like Boulder, where we've been based out of, have a very vibrant startup tech community. So that's one thing. I think having that support is an important part of it. And part of that is cultural, you know, tolerance for failure, tolerance for an appetite for risk. The second thing is the desire to create things that can scale massively. So I think Australia culturally is more likely to produce businesses which are good lifestyle businesses and might be very successful. But the creation of a scalable web startup is probably the exception to the rule in the Australian market, and they tend to come over here. Yeah.
So you're obviously very passionate about this.
Yeah.
And you mentioned your two co-founders. How did you connect with your two co-founders? And have they come over here with you, or are they back in Australia still working away there?
Okay, so Jo's based over here as well. She looks after our marketing and evangelism, essentially. So she's the business person on the team. And she's actually doing graduate research into social media and its use for corporate and crisis communications at the University of Colorado. And so she's involved with the Atlas program there and the Computer Science School and the School of Mass Communications and Research. And there's a lot of, I think, academic interest in the area that we're working on too. So Jo's already moved over. Darren, who is our user experience and front end guy, is currently based out of Melbourne, but we're trying to get him moved over here at the moment as well.
Okay.
So hopefully sometime in the next couple of months.
And how did you three first meet?
Okay,
How
so
did you connect?
we first worked together at PBL, which I mentioned before, which is basically Australia's biggest media company. And we were lucky enough to work together on the computer magazines there. And so we worked together on a lot of the early web properties that took off. So some of the stuff that fed into the local version of MSN in Australia, MSN. And there's some big magazine properties in Australia that we worked on getting onto the web, such as the Australian Women's Weekly and the Bulletin Newsweek magazine and Harper's Bazaar and quite a few other consumer titles. So I had experience working together on building scalable web properties and for consumer markets in the past. And we work really well together as a team.
Okay. So you originally went to Boulder, but now you decided to come into Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, our theory is that we'll go wherever is best for the growth and development of the business. So while we've been pre-launch, Boulder has actually been great. It's a really interesting town. It's got a vibrant startup community ecosystem there. It was a much smaller town to break into and to get to know people. Silicon Valley is pretty daunting when you're coming across from Australia. But at the same time, our theory was always, well, it's a lower cost structure, high level of education per capita. There's quite a lot of venture capital there, a lot of startups, a lot of software developers per capita. But if what we do takes off and if we're able to attract funding, then Silicon Valley is the natural place to be. The other option would be New York because of the concentration of media with the space that we're working in. But my best guess on what will happen is that if we can get launched, get a few tens of thousands or up to 100,000 users, which is our aim for the beta, then we think if we can demonstrate some traction that we'll be able to raise some seed funding because we've just bootstrapped to date, which has been pretty tough. And if we can get funding, then we'll be able to more easily afford to move out here. And so that's our plan. And the theory we're following is that, well, certainly the advice we've had from everyone in the Founder Institute and pretty much everyone we've dealt with is you've got to get to the valley, you've got to get to the valley. This is where all the people are, this is where the ideas are, and this is where the concentration of capital is. And when I was a little kid living in Queensland, I had a poster up on my wall of Silicon Valley with all my favourite companies pinned in it. So Apple and Sun, and there were quite a few pins in there. So for me, having been developing software since I was a little kid, it's always felt like a natural, a strong magnetic force pulling you if you're interested in startups and in software and technology to try and get over here. So at the end of the day, wherever we need to go for the sake of the business is where we'll go. But there's a strong emotional pull, I think, if you're trying to do startups to try and get to Silicon Valley as well. And that's a very powerful force too.
Sure.
And the fact that lots of other people similarly feel that pull is part of the reason why there's such a vibrant ecosystem here. And I didn't realise, even though I had a romanticised idea of what the Valley was in my head, particularly having sort of worked in, as a developer and in computer publications, and the reality of it is, in fact, much more powerful than the romanticised notion. One of the things I found coming out here and being involved in the accelerator and getting to meet other people is that the ecosystem here is actually a lot more powerful than I'd ever thought in theory it would be. There is something about the concentration of talent and ideas and people and capital, and it makes magic happen. It's a little bit hard to describe, but there is a deep, powerful force at work when you get that much concentration of things together.
It is a different area, and the numbers speak volumes. I was looking at some numbers recently from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Everybody wants to be the next Silicon Valley. Austin, New York, doesn't matter where. And I'd have thought over the last 10 years that the percentage of venture capital would have gone down in Silicon Valley as these areas. In fact, it's the reverse. It's continued to climb up. So you're absolutely right. There is that something special here. Now, okay, let's bring us on to some other stuff. What stage is TriedVibe in at the moment? Do you have a product?
Okay, so we're pre-alpha at the moment.
Okay.
We're essentially in the final stages of testing, debugging, and trying to improve the performance. We're hoping to get out this next couple of weeks and start opening up access to the alpha. We've got about, or nearly 4,000 people who have requested invites to the alpha, and our plan is to start rolling out access sort of 50 to 100 people at a time. Because of the nature of the product, because it's going out in real time, talking to all the different web APIs, and rather than using a traditional spidering indexing approach, we're trying to work in real time. And so the performance of, if you put a blog post out, say, and you want to know who's talking about it or see who's sharing it or linking through to it, that's something that when you first put it out, you really want to know right there and then what activity is happening around it. For a couple of reasons. One, just ego, so you can see the activity that's happening. But secondly, so that you can jump in and get involved in the conversation. So the performance of what we're doing has to be really fast in terms of not sort of performance in terms of, calculating all the stuff around it necessarily so that you've got a complete picture right there and then. But you need to start returning results very quickly so people can see the activity around their content. So we have to return a good view of what's happening around the web in pretty close to real time. We've got a few seconds to bring that back. So our big challenge is, well, how do you return results very quickly when you're talking to, literally potentially hundreds of different sites and sources and networks out there. So getting that right has been hard. I'd been working on that problem for, I think I mentioned to you, about a year and a half before we even came over. But we've sort of found as we've got further with the product that really is the key thing. If we can nail that problem of getting back a good picture of the activity around content but do it close to real time, that's key for the product.
So that's one of the questions you're looking to answer with this alpha is, can you get stuff back in real time? Let me ask you a double-barrel question here. What other one or two key questions are you looking to answer that go from assumptions to provable fact? And how much money are you looking to try to raise to help you to do this?
Okay, so one of the assumptions we've got is that what we're doing is scalable. That we've come up with a distributed model for how the technology that goes out and collects the data works. Essentially, we're running stuff both on the server side, and we're using a cloud computing infrastructure for that, a mix of Amazon EC2 and Google's App Engine. And then we're doing some interesting stuff client side to get around the rate limits on APIs and some of the other challenges of spreading out the amount of activity so it's not all happening from our servers. So one of our assumptions that we're trying to prove with the alpha is, okay, that this will work, that if you can get enough people using the tool, that it in fact will improve the performance of the tool.
Okay, all right.
The theory, so part of what we do is
that's useful.
With TriedVibe, one of the things you can do if you're a publisher or a blogger or using social media for marketing is you can put a badge on your site or on your blog that tells people, okay, the count of how much activity there is around the content. And when a user clicks on it, they can see a picture of all that activity summarized.
Okay.
So because of the way we're working, the more people who carry that badge, the more people essentially are looking up what's happening around the web, and the more accurate and up-to-date the information will be. So our theory is that if we can start a viral loop going, if we can get people so that they start adding this onto their pages and onto their blog, it will improve how fast the results are coming back.
That's pretty interesting, because there's the benefit to more people joining into it.
That's right. Good. So the more people who are using it, the more up-to-date every additional person who comes in will see their information as well.
Okay.
So that's one of our assumptions. And then really, as I mentioned, we've bootstrapped to date. So
Yeah.
we're just by doing consulting work back home and services work and whatever we could to get ourselves over here and get set up. And we figured right from the start, look, if we can get this thing launched and get 50 or 100,000 users and demonstrate some traction and start having people carrying this badge, then we should be able to establish this as a metric by which people measure the amount of activity around content.
Mm-hmm.
And if we can do that, then the value of the company should be high. We've essentially got an algorithm, a drumbeat algorithm, which is measuring the impact of content.
Mm-hmm.
We figured to really what we need to raise funds for once we get to that point is to add developers so we can add more features and add more connectors to the different
Sure.
sites across the web. And secondly, to pay for hosting. So just to give you an idea, because of the amount of, we've sort of thrown in the top 100 tech bloggers, top 100 mummy bloggers, so content from a reasonable number of sites to get a picture, to make sure they're sort of seeded with a reasonable amount of content. So our Amazon EC2 bills are already up to $2,000 a month, and that's before we've got a single user. So that's the other thing we need to raise some funds for, is to cover the hosting. But we figured to get through the beta and to get to 100,000 users, you know, and to add 2 or 3 developers, we could do that with seed funding of maybe $500,000. So that's the sort of level that we're going to look for.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Unfortunately, there's a lot more I could ask you about. We are running out of time here. So do you have one last bit of information, one last nugget that would help entrepreneurs that you think that you could pass along?
Okay, for us, I've mentioned to you before, but getting into an accelerator program, so the funded Founder Institute, that was like us putting on rocket boosters in terms of getting access to mentors and support and help. The second thing is to engage with the community. So the S-Face sessions we've been to, so there was first impressions, we've been to a couple of the VC breakfast club meetings. Yeah. For us, being able to learn how to pitch and explain what we're doing has been incredibly beneficial.
Unfortunately, we have to wrap up now, so thank you all very much. It's been a terrific evening. Jed, very much appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you again next month. Thank you and good night.